Could Avengers Doomsday's new trailer have secretly revealed that a part of Tony Stark's story is still alive behind Doctor Doom's mask? At first glance, the trailer seems focused on Doom's power, his new armor, and the massive scale of the multiverse. We see Doom facing Mjolnir, Boris standing beside him, in a mysterious portrait that has already divided fans into completely different theories. But the more I look at this trailer, the more it feels like Marvel may have hidden its most important clue somewhere much quieter. Not in a giant action sequence, but in the way Doom behaves. Because this isn't simply the introduction of a new villain. Marvel appears to be establishing a character whose technology, obsession, arrogance, and constant evolution echo some of the most recognizable traits of Tony Stark. And if that connection is intentional, then I Am Doom may not simply be a villain introducing himself. It could become a dark reflection of one of the MCU's most iconic lines, "I am Iron Man." And once we start connecting the smaller details, that possibility becomes much harder to ignore. The first major clue comes directly from Doom's armor. In the trailer, we see Dr. Doom falling from a ship, only to change his suit in mid-air. On the first viewing, this might simply look like an impressive visual transformation. Marvel is clearly showing us how advanced Doom's technology has become. But there is a much more interesting question hiding underneath it. Why does Doom need to change his armor so quickly? If he already possesses such an advanced suit, why not simply continue using the same one? Instead, Doomsday appears to be giving us multiple versions of Doom's armor and masks. We have seen different designs around the D23 event, another variation connected to the Fantastic Four post-credit scene, and now another suit appearing during the trailer. That starts to establish a very specific character trait. Doom is never satisfied. He constantly improves his defensive enchantments, modifies his scientific technology, and upgrades himself after every confrontation. And in the MCU, there is one character who became famous for exactly this kind of obsessive technological evolution: Tony Stark. Tony Stark's defining characteristic was never simply the Iron Man armor. His real superpower was his mind. Whenever Tony encountered a problem, he never simply accepted it. He studied it, identified its weakness, and built the next version. From Mark 1 all the way to Mark 85, the Iron Man suits represented Tony's constant drive to improve himself. Every major battle created another upgrade. Every failure became another lesson. Other heroes could change their suits when the story demanded it. But Tony's evolution was almost continuous. And now, when we see Dr. Doom repeatedly appearing with different armor configurations, that same behavioral pattern is emerging again. Maybe Marvel isn't telling us that Doom is literally Tony Stark. Maybe the connection is even more interesting than that. Perhaps Doom and Tony operate according to the same philosophy. Both believe they can solve problems that nobody else can. Both use technology as both a weapon and a shield. Both refuse to accept their limitations. And both believe that if they are intelligent enough, powerful enough, and determined enough, they can reshape the world around them. But the armor similarities are only the beginning. Another clue comes from Doom's overall presence. His body language, confidence, dialogue delivery, and the way he appears to control every situation carry a strangely familiar energy. Robert Downey Jr. being cast as Dr. Doom was already one of the most fascinating decisions Marvel could have made. But if Marvel is deliberately making audiences feel echoes of Tony Stark through Doom, then the casting suddenly has an entirely different purpose. Even a line like "new mask, same task" becomes more interesting through that lens. The mask has changed, but the mission remains the same. And if we imagine for a moment that the person behind that mask is an alternate Tony Stark, someone whose face has been damaged, whose accent has changed, and whose identity has evolved, then suddenly the entire scene feels surprisingly natural. I Am Tony Stark and I Am Doom create a strange parallel. One identity ended its journey through sacrifice and heroism, while the other could represent the darkest possible evolution of the same arrogance, intelligence, and ambition. That's why the connection between Doom and Tony may not be limited to their appearance. Marvel could be building a psychological connection between two men who, in different circumstances, might have become remarkably similar.
And then the trailer gives us the mysterious portrait. This small visual detail could actually reveal the emotional core of Dr. Doom's entire story. Fans are divided over whether the portrait shows Doom's wife and son, or his mother, Cynthia Von Doom, and a young version of Doom himself. The first interpretation certainly creates an emotional possibility, but the second one has a fascinating piece of visual evidence behind it. In the portrait, the mother appears to place her hand against the child's chest, and in the corresponding trailer moment, Doom touches his own chest in almost the exact same place. If you were simply remembering a wife or child, the gesture could carry a different meaning. But if he is remembering his mother, the moment suddenly becomes much more personal. In the comics, Cynthia Von Doom is deeply connected to Victor's origin and emotional motivation. So if the MCU is adapting elements of Cynthia's story, this portrait may not simply be a family painting. It could be a visual representation of the one emotional wound Doom has never been able to escape.
And that is what could make Doctor Doom even more dangerous. Villains become far more unpredictable when they have something deeply personal to lose. Doom's ambition may not simply be about conquering the multiverse. His actions could be driven by an old personal loss. Cynthia's story could explain why he is willing to cross boundaries that even other villains would consider impossible. Think about the kind of character Marvel would be creating here. A man who has mastered science and magic, developed technology capable of reaching across realities, and gained enough power to challenge entire universes. And yet he still could not save his mother. For someone like Doom, the multiverse wouldn't simply be a playground for power. It would become an opportunity, a chance to find a reality where his mother is alive, or perhaps to defeat the forces that destroyed his life in the first place. And if that portrait really is Cynthia Von Doom, then Marvel may be revealing Doom's emotional motivation without ever explaining it directly. But that immediately creates another question. If Doom is willing to challenge the multiverse because of his past, why would he need the TVA? And more importantly, why would he want to see Tony Stark? That brings us to one of the biggest rumors surrounding Doomsday, the TVA. According to the rumors, Doctor Doom could eventually enter the TVA while searching for Steve Rogers or Loki, destroying anyone who stands in his way before reaching the Time Theater. If that storyline actually becomes part of the movie, then the TVA would be much more than another location. It would become Doom's gateway into the multiverse. The Time Theater could give him something almost no normal villain could ever possess: the ability to observe the lives of people across different realities. And this is where the rumor becomes especially interesting. Doom reportedly looks at the life of another universe's Tony Stark. Now the question is no longer simply whether Tony and Doom are connected. The bigger question becomes, why would Doom specifically want to see Tony? Is he trying to understand another version of himself? Is he searching for technology? Or does he encounter a version of Tony whose life forces him to confront what he could have been? If Loki arrives during that moment and Doom defeats him, the confrontation becomes even more significant. Because Loki is already deeply connected to time, identity, and the structure of the multiverse. This is where the Tony Stark connection could evolve from a simple fan theory into an actual narrative possibility. Imagine Doom standing inside the Time Theater with countless timelines in front of him. He can observe alternate versions of humanity, heroes, villains, and entire worlds. Yet, his attention stops on Tony Stark. Why? Perhaps because Tony is the one person Doom recognizes himself in. A genius, an inventor, an arrogant man who believes he can solve problems that everyone else considers impossible. A man who constantly upgrades his technology and eventually transforms that intelligence into a heroic sacrifice. Doom could represent the opposite outcome of the same formula. Tony turned intelligence into responsibility. Doom could turn intelligence into domination. And if Marvel is deliberately building that contrast, then Tony's presence, even as a memory, alternate version, vision, or hidden connection, could give Doom's character an emotional dimension. Suddenly, the real question isn't, is Tony Stark secretly Doctor Doom? The more interesting question becomes, what if Doctor Doom is the dark mirror of Tony Stark? Two geniuses facing the same fundamental question, but choosing completely different answers. If you possess the power to change the world, what are you willing to become in order to control it? But the future of the MCU isn't only about Tony. Secret Wars also raises a huge question about the multiversal Spider-Man legacy. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man variants became much more than nostalgia after No Way Home. They became emotional symbols of the MCU's multiverse. So naturally, fans are asking what happens to them after Secret Wars. According to current rumors, neither Spider-Man may immediately receive another solo movie, but that doesn't necessarily mean their stories are finished. There has been speculation that around the end of the Mutant Saga, projects such as Avengers Judgment Day could bring both Spider-Man back for additional appearances. If that happens, Marvel wouldn't simply be using them as nostalgia cameos. They could become important pieces of the post-Secret Wars universe. At the same time, There has been speculation that the MCU could introduce two different versions of Doctor Doom, but when Robert Downey Jr. is being positioned as the face of such a massive villain, creating an unnecessary fake-out with two separate Dooms would make the story far more complicated. And that's exactly why the trailer may be revealing only the smallest fraction of what Marvel has planned.
RDJ's casting itself could actually be one of Marvel's biggest storytelling weapons. Marvel knows what audiences feel when they see Robert Downey Jr. We immediately remember Tony Stark. That association cannot simply disappear because he was wearing a different mask. So putting that face behind Doctor Doom's armor automatically creates psychological tension. When Doom upgrades his technology, we think of Tony. When he delivers a confident line, we remember Tony. When he says, "I am Doom," the audience naturally hears an echo of "I am Iron Man." That could be completely intentional. If Marvel understands that connection and uses it throughout Doomsday, then defeating Doom becomes emotionally complicated. The heroes wouldn't just be fighting another villain. They would be fighting a distorted reflection of Tony Stark's legacy. And perhaps that is exactly why the possibility of Tony returning in Secret Wars becomes so important. Marvel could be preparing the audience to recognize the difference between the man Tony became and the man Doom represents.
Now we reach the theory that could turn Secret Wars into one of the most emotional events in MCU history. According to the theory, when Doctor Doom creates Battleworld, he could resurrect heroes while wiping their memories. These characters would live inside a completely new reality without remembering who they really were. And within that world, the possibility of the original Tony Stark returning becomes incredibly interesting. Imagine Tony being resurrected but having absolutely no memory of being Iron Man. He doesn't remember the Avengers. He doesn't remember Endgame. He doesn't remember sacrificing himself to save half the universe. He simply exists as another person inside Doom's reality. The theory goes even further, suggesting that Tony could be living in a corrupted version of Asgard alongside Loki. Then a resistance group could eventually reach them and begin restoring the memories of the heroes. Slowly, Tony starts remembering who he was. He remembers the armor. He remembers the Avengers. He remembers the people he lost. And eventually, he remembers the final sacrifice that ended his original story. At that moment, the question becomes simple but devastating. Will Tony Stark put the armor on one more time? And this is where the parallel between Tony and Doom could reach its ultimate conclusion. On one side, there is a man who lost his mother and became obsessed with controlling the multiverse. On the other, there is a man who sacrificed himself to save his universe. Both are geniuses. Both understand technology. Both believe they can solve impossible problems. But their choices define them. For Doom, power may mean control. For Tony, power ultimately became responsibility. So if Secret Wars brings these two characters face to face, it wouldn't simply be a hero versus villain battle. It would be a collision between two different versions of genius. And if Tony's memories are restored, his return wouldn't be emotional simply because Iron Man is back. It would be emotional because we would be watching a character we already said goodbye to rediscover the reason he became a hero in the first place. Standing across from him would be a villain wearing the face of the same actor, carrying the same echoes of intelligence and confidence, but representing everything Tony chose not to become. And perhaps that is why the Doomsday trailer feels like it is hiding so much in plain sight. The Mjolnir moment, Boris standing beside Doom, the multiple armor designs, the mysterious portrait, the rumored destruction of the TVA, Loki's possible confrontation, the alternate Tony Stark, and the Battleworld theories surrounding Secret Wars may look like completely separate pieces. But when you connect them, one theme keeps appearing: identity. What is behind Doom's mask? Who is really in that portrait? Why would Doom specifically study another Tony Stark? What does Loki know about the future of the multiverse? Who will these heroes become after their memories are erased? And if Tony Stark truly returns, will he be the exact same Tony we remember, or a completely different version shaped by everything that happened after Endgame? We still don't have definitive answers, and that uncertainty may be exactly what Marvel wants. Because Doomsday doesn't appear to be simply building toward Avengers versus Doctor Doom. It could be building toward a collision between Doom's identity, Tony Stark's legacy, and the future of the multiverse itself. And if Moon Knight, Wolverine, Deadpool, Loki, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the rest of these characters eventually stand together on the same battlefield, Secret Wars may become more than a crossover. It could become the payoff to years of stories about sacrifice, identity, alternate realities, and the consequences of trying to control a universe that was never meant to be controlled. Maybe the trailer hasn't shown us the ending at all. Maybe it has only given us the first glimpse of the truth hiding behind the mask. But there is still one piece of this puzzle that makes the Tony Stark connection even more interesting. Because if Marvel really wants us to question the relationship between Tony and Doom, then the most important clue may not be Doom's face, his armor, or even his dialogue. It could be the way Doom sees himself. Tony Stark spent years trying to prove that his technology could protect the people he cared about, but every upgrade came from a fear of failure. He built better armor because the previous armor wasn't enough. He created new systems because the last system had failed him. In a strange way, Tony's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He could never accept that he had reached his limit. And that same obsession appears to be present inside Doctor Doom. The difference is, what happens when that obsession is combined with absolute power? Tony eventually learned that there were things even he could not control. Doom may refuse to learn that lesson. If he believes every failure can be solved with another upgrade, another spell, another armor, or another universe, then the multiverse itself becomes nothing more than one giant problem waiting for him to solve. And that could explain why Doom keeps changing his suits so rapidly. He isn't changing them because the old armor looks outdated. That philosophy would also explain why the mysterious portrait matters so much. If Cynthia Von Doom really is the woman in that painting, then Doom's obsession with control may have started long before he ever discovered the multiverse. Imagine growing up with the belief that if you had been smarter, stronger, or more powerful, you could have prevented the tragedy that destroyed your family. That kind of guilt can completely reshape a person. Tony Stark experienced something similar after New York, after Ultron, and after losing Peter in the snap. His response was always the same: build something that makes sure it never happens again. Doom could be following the same emotional pattern, only without the moral boundaries that eventually changed Tony. Tony's fear pushed him toward protection. Doom's grief could push him toward control. And suddenly the portrait becomes more than a clue about Doom's mother. It becomes the foundation for understanding why Doom might eventually believe that the only way to save the people he loves is to control every possible reality. That is a terrifying idea, because from Doom's perspective, he may not even see himself as the villain. He may genuinely believe that he is the only person capable of fixing everything. And if that is his mindset, then the TVA becomes the perfect place for him to go. Because the TVA represents something Doom desperately needs: information. Infinite information. Every timeline, every possibility, every version of the people he knows, every decision that could have created a different outcome. The Time Theater could allow Doom to look at the lives of alternate versions of himself and other major characters. But why would Tony Stark stand out among all of them? Because Tony could represent the one version of Doom's potential that took a completely different path. Maybe Doom sees a Tony who had every reason to become selfish, arrogant, and destructive, yet eventually chose sacrifice. That could create a level of obsession that goes beyond technology. Doom might want to understand why Tony succeeded where he failed. Or perhaps he wants to prove that Tony's choice was wrong. If Doom believes sacrifice is weakness and control is strength, then Tony's existence becomes an insult to his entire worldview. Tony proves that you can have unimaginable power and still choose to give it away. Doom may believe the opposite, that power only matters if you are willing to use it. This could also give Loki's role in Doomsday a much deeper purpose. Loki has spent years dealing with the consequences of identity, destiny, timelines, and free will. He began as someone obsessed with becoming powerful enough to rule others, but eventually became someone willing to sacrifice his own freedom to keep the multiverse alive. In many ways, Loki and Tony have already walked versions of the same journey. Both started from selfish motivations. Both became obsessed with control. Both eventually discovered that real heroism required sacrifice. And now Doctor Doom could stand opposite both of them as the character who refuses to accept that lesson. That makes a Doom versus Loki confrontation far more meaningful than simply another superhero fight. Loki represents someone who finally accepted that he could not control everything. Doom represents someone who believes he absolutely must. And Tony, if he is watching from another timeline or somehow becomes part of this story, represents the man who learned that the ultimate act of control is sometimes letting go. Three characters, three different answers to the same question, and one collapsing multiverse forcing them to choose again. That is also why the idea of Doom defeating Loki inside the TVA would be such a major moment. If Loki is protecting the structure of the multiverse, Doom defeating him could symbolize the collapse of everything Loki sacrificed himself to protect. It would tell the audience immediately that this villain is operating on another level. But there is another possibility hidden inside that confrontation. Maybe Doom doesn't simply want to kill Loki, maybe he needs something from him. Loki is connected to the end of time, the timelines, and the very architecture of reality. If Doom is trying to create his own perfect universe, Loki could possess knowledge that Doom cannot obtain through technology or magic alone. And that could explain why Doom would enter the TVA personally, rather than simply sending an army. He needs to see the system for himself. He needs to understand how reality works. And once he discovers the limits of that system, he can begin replacing it with one designed according to his own rules.
That brings us back to Battleworld and the Secret Wars theory. If Doom eventually succeeds in reshaping reality, then the heroes waking up without their memories would not simply be a convenient plot device. It would be the ultimate demonstration of Doom's philosophy. He would have created a world where nobody remembers the mistakes that created the multiverse crisis. No Avengers, no Civil War, no Snap, no Endgame, no lost loved ones, no painful memories. From Doom's perspective, he may believe he has finally solved the problem. He has taken away suffering by taking away the memories that caused it. But the irony is that he would also erase the identities of the very heroes who made the universe worth saving. That is where the resistance becomes important. They wouldn't simply be fighting to defeat Doom. They would be fighting to give everyone their identities back. And if Tony is among those people, his memory returning could become the moment when the entire Battleworld illusion begins to collapse. Imagine Tony remembering everything at once. Not just the good memories, but the painful ones too. The cave, Pepper, Peter, the Avengers, Thanos, the Snap, his final conversation with his daughter, the moment he looked at the stones and knew what he had to do. Doom's entire philosophy would tell Tony that those memories are unnecessary pain. But Tony would understand something Doom never could. Pain is part of identity. Loss changes you. Failure teaches you. Sacrifice gives meaning to survival. If you remove every painful memory, you don't create a perfect person. You create someone who no longer understands why they should care. That could be the emotional argument at the heart of Secret Wars. Doom wants a perfect universe because he cannot accept loss. Tony may return to remind everyone that a meaningful universe is not one without loss. It is one where people choose what to do with it. And this could finally explain why Marvel would want Robert Downey Jr. to play Doom at this particular moment in the MCU. The studio isn't simply bringing back a familiar face. It is creating a visual contradiction. Every time audiences see Doom, they will remember Tony. Every time Tony's legacy is mentioned, Doom will be standing in the shadow of it. That tension could continue all the way through Doomsday and into Secret Wars. And if the ultimate plan really is to bring OG Tony Stark back, then Marvel would have created a situation where the same face represents two completely opposite outcomes. One man became a symbol of sacrifice. The other became a symbol of control. One said, "I am Iron Man." The other says, "I am Doom." And the final confrontation between them would not need 1,000 lines of exposition. The audience would understand the symbolism instantly. There's also another reason the Spider-Man variants could become important in this same story. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield represent two heroes who have already experienced alternate versions of their own lives. They've lived through different tragedies, different relationships, different failures, and different endings. No Way Home brought them together because the multiverse allowed them to see versions of themselves that could have existed. Secret Wars could take that concept even further. If Battleworld erases their memories, they could once again be forced to rediscover what makes them Spider-Man. Tobey's Peter has already learned that responsibility comes with painful consequences. Andrew's Peter has already experienced devastating loss and found a way to keep going. Their presence could reinforce the same theme that Tony and Doom represent. Identity is not simply the memories you possess, it is the choices you make because of those memories. And that is why I think the biggest danger in Avengers Doomsday may not be Doctor Doom destroying a city, defeating an Avenger, or even conquering the TVA. The real danger could be Doom convincing everyone that he is right. Because if Doom creates Battleworld as a world without pain, some heroes might actually believe they are better off there. A world where nobody remembers losing anyone. A world where the snap never happened. A world where Tony Stark never died. A world where Peter Parker never lost Aunt May. A world where every hero gets the ending they wanted. The temptation would be enormous. And that could make the Resistance story much more emotional. They wouldn't just be fighting against Doom's army. They would be fighting against a reality that looks better than the one they came from. They would have to choose the painful truth over the comfortable lie.
Which brings us back to that portrait. If it really is Cynthia Von Doom, then Doom may be trying to build the universe he always wanted, because he cannot accept the universe that took his mother away. And if Tony Stark returns, he could become the character who understands exactly why Doom's plan is doomed to fail. Tony also lost people. Tony also wanted to prevent death. Tony also believed that enough technology could solve anything. But eventually, he learned that some sacrifices cannot be undone. You can't invent your way out of grief. You can't armor yourself against loss. And you cannot control every possible future. That lesson is what made Tony a hero. Doom's refusal to learn it may be what turns him into the greatest threat the Avengers have ever faced. So when we look back at that trailer, maybe the most important question isn't whether Doom is secretly Tony Stark. Maybe that theory is too simple. The real question could be whether Tony Stark and Doctor Doom are two different answers to the same tragedy. One accepted that he could not save everyone and chose to sacrifice himself anyway. The other refuses to accept that limitation and decides to reshape reality until nobody can ever take anything from him again. And if Marvel really is building toward that contrast, then Avengers Doomsday is only the beginning. The portrait, the armor upgrades, the TVA, Loki, alternate Tony, Battleworld, the Spider-Man, and eventually the return of Iron Man could all be pieces of the same larger story. A story about what happens when a man gains the power to rewrite reality, but still cannot rewrite his own past. And if that is what Secret Wars is ultimately about, then the biggest battle may not be between heroes and villains at all. It may be between the reality we wish we could have and the reality we have to accept. But there is one final possibility that could completely change the way we understand Doctor Doom. Because maybe Marvel isn't asking us to discover who is behind the mask. Maybe Marvel wants us to understand why the mask exists in the first place. Tony Stark spent his entire life hiding behind different versions of armor. The armor protected him physically, but it also became an extension of his identity. When Tony put on the Iron Man suit, he wasn't simply becoming stronger. He was becoming the version of himself he wanted the world to see. Doctor Doom could be doing exactly the same thing, only in a much darker way. His armor may not simply be designed to survive attacks. It could represent the identity he has chosen for himself. Victor Von Doom may have suffered, failed, and lost people he loved, but Doctor Doom is the version of himself that refuses to ever be powerless again. And suddenly, the constant suit changes become symbolic. Every new armor is another step away from the vulnerable person underneath. Every upgrade is another attempt to eliminate weakness. Every mask is another layer between Doom and the memories he refuses to confront. That makes the Tony Stark comparison even more fascinating, because Tony eventually learned to take the armor off emotionally. Doom may have decided that the armor is all he needs. And perhaps the most dangerous possibility is that Tony Stark's return could actually be connected to Doom's own origin. What if Doom's obsession with alternate Tony isn't because he wants to defeat him? What if he wants to understand him? Because somewhere in the multiverse, Tony Stark represents the version of himself who made the right choices. That would make the Time Theater scene incredibly personal. Doom could watch Tony's entire life and see a reflection of his own potential. He could see the inventions, the arrogance, the mistakes, the people Tony loved, and eventually the sacrifice. And instead of admiring Tony, Doom could become obsessed with proving that he could have done it better. He could convince himself that Tony was weak because he allowed himself to die. And that belief could become the final reason Doom tries to resurrect and control the very people Tony sacrificed himself to save. This could also explain why the mysterious portrait feels so important, despite appearing for only a brief moment. Marvel has always used visual storytelling to reveal character history, without stopping the movie to explain everything. If the woman in that portrait really is Cynthia Von Doom, then the image could represent the one moment in Doom's life that technology cannot repair. He can build an armor capable of fighting Avengers. He can combine science and magic. He can manipulate forces beyond normal human understanding. But none of that can bring his mother back in the way he truly wants. And that failure could be the one thing driving everything else. Maybe Doom doesn't want to conquer the multiverse simply because he wants to rule it. Maybe he wants to prove that no loss is permanent. If one universe took Cynthia from him, then Doom could believe that another universe must exist where she survived. And if it does exist, he may believe he has the right to take it. That is the terrifying part of his philosophy. He could start with grief and end with conquest, without ever realizing when he crossed the line. To Doom, every destroyed timeline may simply be another sacrifice required to reach the one perfect reality he believes he deserves. And this is where Tony Stark becomes the perfect person to place opposite him. Tony's entire MCU journey was built around learning that he could not control everything. In Iron Man, he believed technology could protect him. After New York, he became obsessed with protecting everyone. After Ultron, he tried to create a system that could prevent future threats. After Infinity War, he experienced the consequences of failure in the most personal way possible. And finally, in Endgame, Tony accepted the one thing he had spent his entire life trying to avoid: sacrifice. He could not save everyone and survive. He had to choose. Doom appears to represent the character who never makes that final choice. He refuses to accept that some people cannot be saved. He refuses to accept that some timelines have to end. He refuses to accept that loss is part of existence. So he attempts to build a universe where his decisions are the only decisions that matter. That is why Tony's return in Secret Wars, if it happens, would have enormous thematic value. Tony wouldn't simply return to fight Doom. He could return to prove that Doom's entire philosophy is based on a misunderstanding of what it means to save someone. Now imagine the moment Doom finally encounters Tony after everything he has built. Doom has conquered realities, he has defeated heroes, he has reached the TVA, he has seen countless versions of Tony Stark. He has convinced himself that he understands exactly what Tony represents. And then the real Tony stands in front of him. Not a hologram. Not an alternate version. Not a memory. The original man who sacrificed himself to stop Thanos. Doom would suddenly be forced to confront something he cannot calculate. Tony did not need to survive to win. Tony's greatest victory came from accepting that he would die. For someone like Doom, that idea could be incomprehensible. Why would a genius willingly give up everything? Why would someone with the power to survive choose not to? That is the one equation Doom may never be able to solve. And that could make their confrontation far more powerful than a normal superhero fight. Tony's greatest weapon against Doom might not be another suit or a new piece of technology. It could simply be the lesson Doom spent his entire life refusing to learn. There is another detail that becomes interesting when we look at the possibility of Battleworld. If Doom resurrects heroes but erases their memories, then he is essentially trying to create a universe where history can be rewritten. Everyone gets another chance. Everyone can live without the trauma that shaped them, but that also means Doom becomes the author of everyone's identity. He decides who they are, where they live, what they remember, and what they believe. This is the ultimate expression of control. And that is why the Resistance becomes so important. They are not simply trying to defeat Doom physically. They are trying to restore reality itself. Every recovered memory becomes a small act of rebellion. Every hero who remembers their true identity becomes another piece of Doom's perfect world breaking apart. And Tony could become one of the most important memories to return because his existence represents the opposite of what Doom is trying to create. Tony's story only has meaning because he remembers his mistakes. If you erase those mistakes, you erase the reason he became a hero.
That could create an incredible sequence involving the Avengers rediscovering themselves one by one. A hero remembers a friend, another remembers a battle, someone remembers a sacrifice, someone remembers the people they lost, and eventually, Tony remembers everything. The moment he understands that the world around him is false, the entire illusion changes. He realizes that Doom did not save them. Doom imprisoned them inside a reality designed to make them forget why they fought in the first place. And once Tony understands that, he would have every reason to become Iron Man again. Not because he wants to return to his old life, but because he understands what is at stake. The armor would no longer represent Tony's fear or his need for control. It would represent his choice. That distinction could be the emotional evolution Marvel wants to complete. And if Loki is part of that resistance, the connection becomes even stronger. Loki spent his own journey learning that identity is not determined by destiny. He was expected to become a villain, but he eventually chose to become something else. Tony was expected to remain selfish, but he became a hero. Spider-Man was forced to live with loss, but continued protecting people. Wolverine has endured decades of pain and still chooses to fight. Deadpool has turned trauma into something completely different. Moon Knight represents another complicated identity entirely. These characters all bring different versions of the same idea into Secret Wars. Who are you when everything that defines you is taken away? Doom's answer would be control. The hero's answer would be choice. And that could become the philosophical heart of the entire event. It also explains why the multiverse has become so important to the MCU. The multiverse isn't just an excuse to bring back old characters. It allows Marvel to ask what would happen if these people made different choices. What if Tony became Doom? What if Peter Parker never lost Uncle Ben? What if Loki never changed? What if a different version of the Avengers won? Every alternate reality becomes a reflection of the characters we already know. But Secret Wars could bring all those possibilities together and force the heroes to decide which parts of themselves actually matter. When everything is destroyed and rebuilt, what survives? Not the costumes, not the timelines, not the memories. The choices do. And that is why the connection between Tony and Doom could be much bigger than a surprise twist. It could be the central metaphor of the entire multiverse saga. There's also a reason the trailer's smaller details may matter more than the giant action shots. Anyone can understand a giant battle. Anyone can understand Doom fighting an Avenger. But a portrait, a gesture, a suit transformation, a line of dialogue, or a character staring at another timeline requires the audience to connect the dots. Marvel has always known that the most powerful reveals are sometimes the ones that only make sense after you see the full story. The portrait might seem insignificant until Doom's past is revealed. The armor changes might seem like visual spectacle until we understand his obsession with constant upgrades. The Tony Stark footage might seem like simple nostalgia until we understand why Doom was searching for it. And the RDJ casting might seem like fan service until Tony and Doom finally stand face to face. If that is the structure Marvel is building, then the trailer has already given us the pieces. We just don't know the final picture yet.
If that happens, then Secret Wars would bring everything back to the same question. Can you save people without controlling them? Doom's answer is yes, but only if you control every variable. Tony's answer is no. Sometimes saving someone means accepting that you cannot decide their future for them. That difference is what could make their final confrontation so emotional, because Tony would be fighting someone who looks like him, thinks like him, builds like him, and perhaps even suffered in similar ways, but made one completely different choice. And that is exactly the kind of conflict that can define an entire saga. Not good versus evil in the simplest sense, but one path versus another. One man who accepted his limits, and one man who decided the universe itself would have no limits except his own. So maybe the biggest secret hidden inside Avengers Doomsday isn't that Dr. Doom is secretly Tony Stark. Maybe the secret is that Tony Stark is the one person who can make us understand Dr. Doom. The more we learn about Doom's armor, his mother, his obsession with technology, his connection to the TVA, and his interest in alternate versions of Tony, the more his character starts to resemble a twisted version of the journey Tony already completed. And if Secret Wars eventually brings OG Tony back, Marvel could use that return to finish a story that began more than a decade ago. Tony once believed that the only way to protect everyone was to build something powerful enough to stop every threat. Doom may have reached the same conclusion, except he took it to its absolute extreme. Tony eventually learned to let go. Doom refuses. And when those two philosophies finally collide, the result could be one of the most personal conflicts the MCU has ever attempted. Because behind all the multiverse destruction, behind Battleworld, behind the TVA, behind the alternate heroes and impossible realities, the real battle may come down to one simple question. When you finally have the power to rewrite everything you regret, do you use that power to change the past? Or do you accept it and become the person you were meant to be?